co-host, Anna Gwaltney. She is our new outreach coordinator with the Alliance. She's going to be working with us to develop outreach programs and events, flyers, mailers, things like that, and help us engage with landowners in our watershed. Got a lot of ground to cover today, and hope we have a very good presentation. Anna's going to be asking some questions in the chat box. Please feel free to ask any questions there. I'm not going to answer questions until the end, but at the end, Anna will share some of those questions with me, and we'll do our best to get everything covered in full detail. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So like I said, welcome again to the Alliance Riparian webinar. It is 12:01, so we'll just go ahead and get started. So our mission is proactively protect, enhance, and sustain the water quality of Beaver Lake and the integrity of its watershed. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization operating out of Elkins, Arkansas. We primarily work with landowners in the Beaver Lake watershed, as well as municipalities, government organizations, state, federal, and otherwise. A lot of people often wonder what is a watershed, and so there's many definitions of what a watershed is, but one of the most common ones, and I think most descriptive and most apt, is down here at the bottom. A watershed is an area of land draining all the streams and rainfall to a common outlet, such as the outflow of a reservoir, mouth of a bay, or any point along a stream channel. Some people liken that to a bathtub, where all the water flows into the bathtub, drains out the drain, or a gravy boat, or whatever, sometimes a tiered fountain. But many, as you see down here on the bottom left, many small tributaries or headwater streams collect, gather water, and increase in size until they meet other rivers, and eventually that whole system drains into an ocean, like we see with the Mississippi River. We can see the watersheds of the United States here. The major watershed that we're in is the Missouri-Mississippi drainage basin, this big pink area in the center. That tiny circled area, that's the Beaver Lake watershed. That's our home area right there. And this is a really cool set of maps by Grasshopper Geography. I forget the artist's name, but he's made watershed maps like this worldwide that are color-coded like that. We're a subset of the White River watershed, which drains into the White River, joins the Cache, the Black River, and Current, 11 Point, several other rivers that go up into Missouri. But ours is the White River drainage, which connects to, or starts rather, in the southern part of our watershed, eventually reaches Beaver Lake. And Beaver Dam is kind of the lowest point for our program area. But the White River continues on and drains into Table Rock Lake, Bull Shoals Lake, and continues on until it meets the Mississippi River just above the where the Arkansas meets it, somewhat east of Dumas, I believe. This is our program area. We have 7 primary watersheds, all color-coded here. We operate in 6 counties, Benton, Carroll, Madison, Washington, Franklin, and Crawford. We only have small portions of Franklin and Crawford, so most of our program area, most of our efforts are in those 4 top counties. We also work with 17 municipalities, and the watershed is spread among 2 primary ecoregions, being the Boston Mountains and the Ozark Highlands. The Boston Mountains is basically the southern half of this watershed, and the Ozark Highlands is the northern half. Beaver Lake, you see up here in the purple area up top, was impounded in the 1960s, primarily for flood control and drinking water. And our program area encompasses, or this watershed in our program area encompasses roughly 1,200 square miles, or 1,192 square miles. Some of the most defining characteristics about our watershed are, being up here in the Ozarks, we have steep slopes, which cause flashy streams. We have a lot of springs, and we have a lot of karst geology, which channels water into those springs. We have over 2,800 miles of streams in the Beaver Lake watershed area. So that's a lot of ground to work with, or a lot of water, and a lot of landowners on those streams. Our main intakes for water supply are rather raw water intakes for drinking water in this area, which is a primary goal for Beaver Lake. And one of the main reasons it was impounded are Beaver Water District, Benton Washington Regional Water Authority, Carroll Boone Water District, and Madison County Regional Water District. These are primarily the 4 people who draw water out of Beaver Lake, process it, and for commercial use or residential or industrial use. This is a map of where all that water is produced. Those blue triangles you see up around the lake, up in the top center portion of the map, these are areas where water is drawn out of Beaver Lake and pumped to various regions, which are color-coded respective to the water utility providing that service. One of the biggest servicers in this area is Beaver Water District, this blue in the center. They service several large communities such as Rogers, Springdale, Fayetteville, all the way down to St. Paul. And some others like Benton Washington Regional draws from the northern side of the lake, and their water is treated and pumped all the way down to Winslow. Not really featured as much on this map is Carroll Boone. Most of their service area is outside of our program area and to the east as far as Harrison. And Madison County Regional Water Facilities goes all the way to Hinesville, Huntsville. And that's where your drinking water comes from. And that drinking water is very important. It serves as a necessary resource for 500,000 residents in the area. Roughly 1 in 6 Arkansans get their water from Beaver Lake, all the way from Harrison, Arkansas to the Oklahoma border. And I see that grammatical error on border. I need to fix that. Beaver Dam also generates approximately 172 million kilowatt hours of electricity annually. So that's also keeping lights on and keeping businesses operating and things like that. It also serves as a source for recreation and tourism in the area, generating $128 million annually. And it's a cornerstone of community growth and economic development. So you have people boating and fishing and just recreating on the lake. One big effort to maintain the services and the value of Beaver Lake was a drive to make a watershed protection strategy. And this is one of our overarching plans in determining how we make our efforts and where we do projects and things like that. And the 3 primary goals in this strategy are to maintain a long-term, high-quality drinking water supply, meeting present needs and continuing growth of the region, and promoting, restoring the water quality of impaired streams and lakes areas, and minimize additional costs and regulations for people living in and working in the watershed. And what we found through this plan and through several studies is the number one thing impairing waterways in the Beaver Lake watershed is actually sediment. Sediment is the number 1 pollutant in the watershed, and it causes several problems, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Sediment also introduces excess nutrients into streams through runoff, non-point source pollution, such as potentially toxic bacteria or even non-toxic algal blooms, which deplete water quality, degrade water quality, deplete oxygen in the water, and cause several problems. Sediment reduction priorities for the Beaver Lake watershed are mostly the West Fork, the Lower White, and the Beaver Lake or Lakeside area in red. We also focus a lot on War Eagle Creek, and while not considered priority sediment reduction areas, we still do a lot of work in Brush Creek, Richland Creek, East Fork, and Headwaters, and Middle Fork in these 10 areas. One of the bigger challenges facing this area is, of course, as a very hot topic right now, is the rapid population growth in northwest Arkansas. We are the 14th fastest growing region in the United States, and this is very outdated data, but from 2019 we are adding about 32 people per day, and about 500,000 residents are added by the end of the month. And one of the consequences of that population growth is development. Sometimes it's not always, sometimes it's rapid development, and sometimes one thing that tends to go along with that rapid development is urban sprawl and the introduction of impervious surfaces like pavements, parking lots, things like that. A lot of things that are hot topics that people like to talk about. But a lot of times, what that impervious surface does is it exacerbates stormwater, makes our streams much more flashier, which we'll see a little bit in a later. It also interrupts the hydrologic cycle. So on the left, we see an area that's got some development, but it's not really intense. And as we see more development, we tend to see less infiltration of stormwater because there's less green area, less exposed soil, plant vegetation, and things like that to manage and process that stormwater. And so what it does is you have more stormwater going into streams, waterways, and things like that. And sometimes it's more than that stream can handle, or the stream might have to move around to regain its equilibrium, which we'll also see a little bit later on. One of the biggest ways we see that is through flooding issues in urban areas like South Fayetteville and the Town Bridge Trail. Sometimes that heightened amount of water or heightened volume of water can cause flooding issues just because it doesn't have anywhere to go. Sometimes that land use can also cause an increase in an erosive force like we're seeing here. In this one situation, the water is flowing from the southwest to the northeast. And when more water is put into that stream, it increases the erosive force of that water as it's impacting a bank. And so what we typically see as a river is trying to regain what we call dynamic equilibrium or stability. It will swing back and forth, and as it's doing so, it clips banks and causes incisive erosion. And that causes sedimentation and loss of water quality. So one of the biggest things we do to combat that is the introduction and implementation of riparian buffers or riparian areas. These are areas which naturally occur along stream sides, waterways, and lakes. They're vegetated areas. They typically don't have a lot of management. And what they do is they give that stormwater a place to go and a place to be infiltrated down into the soil. And that way there's not as much water in the stream or in the lake itself. So it is recharging groundwater, and it's not causing erosion when it's doing that. Sometimes those riparian areas, when they're incorporated into development or implemented intentionally, they're called buffers. And so we might be using that term a little bit interchangeably. As we see in this instance, we have a riparian buffer that has been implemented, and there's not much management occurring on it, but we do see some light development on either side of it in the form of these fields on the two adjoining hills. So there are multiple types of these riparian buffers. We're really only going to talk about one today. There is a lot of thought into what goes into the establishment and the delineation of a riparian buffer. There's several factors that can go into that, such as the slope of the area above the buffer zone, the erodibility of the soils, and what kind of vegetation is present, the size of the stream, and sometimes these can lead to the development or implementation of a variable width stream that's just basically the width of the buffer itself is respective to several of those variables. Sometimes municipalities like keeping things simple, and they just implement a fixed zone, and that's basically a smaller stream or headwater stream will have a 25-foot buffer, and a larger stream will have a 150-foot buffer, and things like that. But typically what we look at and what we'll talk about here is what's called a three-zone buffer, or it's basically a tiered system of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous flora. Herbaceous is just a botanical term that means any grasses and wildflowers. If it's smaller than a tree or a shrub and is not woody vegetation, then we usually call it herbaceous. This consists of three zones that you'll see here. Closest to the stream is usually a mixture of tall trees as well as grasses, and some what we call hydrophytic, which is basically just a water-loving plant that we'll see. These are going to be what's closest to the stream. These are plants that typically can respond well to disturbances in their ecosystems, such as flooding, animal disturbances, such as beavers, things like that. They tend to regenerate and recover pretty quickly from that. The second zone is typically shrubs, or what's sometimes called thicket species. They tend to grow fairly densely, and they act as a good barrier or border themselves between tall trees and the more of a prairie ecosystem that's above that. This is naturally ideal habitat for bobwhite quail. So that's something that is commonly talked about. That gives some species like quail opportunity to fly to cover in those shrubs, as well as foraging areas in the grasses and forbs, wildflowers, and things like that. And in the stream bed, we usually see woody debris, roots. All these things contribute to slowing the water velocity, slowing it down, spreading it out. They also introduce habitat for fishes and macroinvertebrates those fishes depend on. So, like your traditional smallmouth bass lurking under a tree root. One other thing I want to talk about. So basically, the bars underneath there run off in groundwater. So if we have a good riparian buffer, when you have stormwater hit this area, that stormwater starts running off in the form of sheet rain, rolling across the surface of the ground, collecting sediment and things like that. And if this riparian buffer didn't exist, that water velocity would escalate and carry any contaminants or particulate matter that's going along with it until it gets into the stream. But with the introduction of a riparian buffer, it slows that runoff down and allows it to seep into the ground and emerge as groundwater. So this groundwater interacts or interfaces with the stream or lake or water body in what's called I don't have it on here, but it's called a hyporheic zone. And we're going to see something kind of like that in this next video. So this was a video I took up at Lake Atalanta up near Rogers one day. And this was an area this was right after a rainfall, and we were seeing several seeps of really nice water flowing into the stream. Look how clear this water is. So this is typically what we see. Stormwater is going to infiltrate down into that ground, and it's going to emerge again as groundwater. And this isn't a stream bed, and so this is perfect groundwater recharge right here. This was a good vegetated surface, lots of filtration for that stormwater, and that's like ideal. So there are some signs of a healthy riparian area, and this is kind of what we look at. This is one of my absolute favorite pictures. This was taken along the White River on the east side. This is just above a stream restoration project that the Watershed Conservation Resource Center was working on, and we were out doing a seed collection event for this brown grass that you see out here is a Riparian Rye Grass. I believe it's Churchill's Wild Rye in this case. And these volunteers look happy. But basically what we want to look at is these tall, healthy trees. We want a good biodiverse mixture of these tall trees, good shrubs. We see a fantastic, healthy grass layer in here, lots of forbs. And so it's this biodiversity that creates a really, really complex assortment of plant matter that's going to absorb that storm water and process it and minimize the impact it has on the surrounding landscape. Sometimes when we interact with landowners, we do see some cases of unhealthy riparian areas, and this is a wonderful opportunity to talk to a landowner. We might see things like livestock having access to the stream, like we see up here below that sentence. We can see a spot where cattle or livestock or something has been walking down into the stream, and with those heavy hoof footprints or heavy hoof walking, they tend to create erosion holes or strip vegetation. We might see some trees and shrubs, but they don't really have that supporting layer of grasses and forbs underneath them. And as we see down here in the bottom left, trees are great, but by themselves they can't do it all alone. And their roots typically don't go that far into the soil, despite what a lot of people might think. And so when just a tree is by the stream, if it doesn't have deep-rooted forbs and grasses along with it, it can easily be eroded away. Above the stream, we also tend to look for short grasses, or especially monocultures of these short grasses. If they're mowed all the way down to the water line, that's a big no-no. That's a big thing we want to warn against, because what that does is it discourages that fibrous root establishment, which is the primary thing that's going to be holding that stream bank together. It's that fibrous root system from those smaller grasses and plants and wildflowers. Some of the other challenges to riparian areas are areas that are not managed They're just kind of left to their own devices, and it's well intentioned, but it can also have some unfortunate consequences. Typically in an ecosystem, you want there to be some disturbance and some effect to come in and kind of shake things around a little bit and give plants an opportunity to reestablish themselves. In nature, this is often in the form of a wildfire or a flood or storm damage or something like that. So typically what we see in these unmanaged areas, they're just left to their own devices, are these dark brooding forest floors. As you see in this picture, there's not a good grass and herbaceous layer. A lot of these seedlings are small and twisted, and that's basically what's called phototropism. That is those plants competing for sunlight, and is diagnostic of there not being enough sunlight available. Numerous vines, because vines are more competitive for that sunlight, and they bolt up trees to take advantage of that sunlight. So this is an environment that favors them. And these areas are highly prone to invasive species, especially some like Chinese privet and bush honeysuckle. And what those do is when they come in, they dominate, they create monocultures, they exclude native species, and you're left with a forest floor that's covered in nothing but exposed soil and leaf litter. That's a recipe for a disaster, because it's highly prone to erosion, and there's almost no fibrous root system that's going to hold that stream bank in place. So this is one thing we look at. Another thing we look at, and then we only recently learned, is destabilized trees in stream beds. Sometimes you have to make a cost-benefit analysis when you're looking at a stream whose center of gravity has the tree's been undermined to the point where its center of gravity is over the stream bed itself. In these cases, this tree is inevitably going to fall in. And while we would love to keep a tree in place in a situation like this, we advocate for taking that tree out. The best thing to do in this case is to remove the roots and maintain as much of the root system as possible. Cut the tree out itself, but maintain that root mass. And because what happens if you don't, eventually this tree is going to fall in, and it's going to drag its root system down with it. And it's going to cause a much bigger problem than if it were just removed. And this is a good example right here, what happens. So this is one landowner we're working with, very excited to be working with. But they'd previously had a brush hogging management above this section, and this is just one spot where it came a little bit close to the stream. I think it was about 5 feet off this picture. And it started to shorten the grass and make it harder for those roots to hold the stream bed in place. There was a tree here. It became weakened by the loss of that fibrous root system, and it eventually caved in. It's off this picture now, and it's gone downstream. But this is a case of what happens if a tree is left in place and falls into the stream itself. Another challenge to streams is they move, and they move a lot. This is on the left here. We have an old Harold Fisk meander map of the Mississippi River from 1944, and this just gives an idea of how much bigger rivers, especially like the Mississippi, have changed course and moved over hundreds and thousands of years. And this is a challenge for management organizations. On the right, we see what's called a government land office. This is a government land office map. This is basically superimposed over current aerial satellite data, satellite imagery. And this is around Elkins. This is the White River, just east of Elkins. And you can see that the government land office surveyed notes of where the river was versus where it is now. You can see just how much that river has moved in over that time. And I forget, I believe this particular section was surveyed in the 1830s, if I recall correctly. On that note, as we talked about dynamic equilibrium earlier, so streams basically want to be in this top wedge. What happens is when a stream moves, or if there's a disturbance, they tend to cause what's called incising, and like the incisors in your mouth, they basically, or like a rabbit's, they have a chewing affection or chewing effect. They start chewing away at the stream bed until they wallow it out, and basically what that's doing is it's that stream bed trying to regain that equilibrium. It's trying to disperse its force over a larger area, and what that causes is it tends to widen out into a more shallow stream bed, as we see if we're going in clockwise direction, and eventually it reobtains that equilibrium state, but not after widening out or flipping and flopping around or wallowing in its own stream bed. And what that tends to cause is it tends to create a much broader stream bed, but it tends to also raise the water column, raise the groundwater level, gives much more of it introduces a floodplain, and increases storage capacity for that stream in the event of floods, as well as much more groundwater availability. So you tend to see much more water-loving plants in a stream bed that's experiencing that dynamic equilibrium. We do try to move things along a little bit through stream bed restorations and bank stabilizations, especially in places where we really don't want to see that stream bed moving around a whole lot due to erosion or risk of flood. And these are just some examples of what we see. So up here on the top left, one of our partner organizations, Watershed Conservation Resource Center, did a terrace planting area over what's called toewood, which you see on the right side of this image. And that's basically storm fallen trees are laid down along the ground, covered with a terraced landscaping, and with plants planted in those terraces. As these plants grow in, they reinforce that stream bed quite a bit. We see another one, similar thing with a plain vegetated area over stone along the Squirrel Creek tributary in the small town of Winslow. Sometimes you also see riprap that's thrown up against eroding stream banks to stabilize them. We might also see these caged stone, what's called a stone gabion. And one of the best things a landowner can do who's experiencing that stream bank erosion is to establish this riparian zone or this riparian buffer. Typically, we do a lot of riparian plantings, which is what's happening here. This landowner was going out with a tractor and putting in what looks like 3-gallon containers. And as those roots grow in, they help reinforce that stream bank. One of the other things is for riparian management is invasive removal. And one thing we're increasingly stressing is as you remove invasive species, you really need to replace them with something else, a native species, which shares that ecological niche. And that's kind of a complex concept, but basically if you're removing one of the most invasive plants in the southern United States are fruiting understory shrubs. And so if you're removing an invasive fruiting understory shrub like Chinese privet or Callery pears or bush honeysuckle, you want to replace it with something native that shares that niche, such as Carolina buckthorn or gray dogwood or native plums or something like that. So why are riparian areas important? Well, basically, they service many things. One of the biggest things that we talk about is water quality. Is just they reduce soil erosion. That soil erosion is a symptom rather, of an unstable stream, and it might take a stream decades to stabilize. And so if we reinforce that stream with a riparian area, it allows it to regain that stability much faster. That erosion has several negative consequences, like we see here. This was from the Chattahoochee River in Georgia. You see this. It's probably a highly eroded stream that's draining into here. And you see all that sediment bloom in the water column. Basically what that sediment bloom does is it covers up macroinvertebrate, fish eggs, amphibian eggs, things like that. And so you don't have much food stock or forage material for predators like fish and things like that would live in that waterway. So if you don't have those creek bugs, if you don't have those macroinvertebrates, you're not going to have fish. Another thing it does is it intercepts contaminants. So we might see, especially along a developed area or an agricultural area, we might see some sheet runoff carrying contaminants like hydrocarbons in it. And so we might see a hydrocarbon slick in the water or something like that. And a riparian area is a fantastic way to both intercept that contaminant as well as process it before it reaches that waterway. Because once it reaches that waterway, it's almost impossible to get out. Another thing they do is they increase the water oxygen, the concentrated dissolved oxygen in the water through a what's called Henry's Law of Solubility. So basically, it's just like leaving a Coke out in a warm room uncovered. Eventually, it loses its carbonation. Well, same thing works for streams. With more sunlight hitting that stream, it lowers the solubility of the stream, of gases in the stream, and one of those is dissolved oxygen. It also increases the likelihood that you're going to have algal blooms in that stream, and that decreased oxygen availability is critical because it can make the stream uninhabitable for macroinvertebrates and for many fishes. That's great for habitat connectivity and just wildlife in general. So you'll see things like green herons, wild turkeys, bobwhite quail we talked about earlier, river otters, eagles. A lot of people don't like them, but snakes too. Snakes are important in an ecosystem. Some people don't want them in their backyard, but that is their habitat. That is their home. So I want to talk about habitat connectivity a little bit. It's kind of a nebulous subject for a lot of people. So basically, if you look up here in the top left, you have a natural area and you have your wildlife down there, up there. So you might see some fairly common animals like deer, rabbits, things like that. But and there might be another nearby natural area that also has a similar population of deer, rabbits, maybe turkeys or something like that. And you might have a stream separating the two, and there might be a crossing where those animals would naturally wander out and visit pastures or something like that. But what you see here is a lack of connectivity means this natural area up here in the top left cannot really share its wildlife, and the wildlife in one area cannot really travel back and forth into another area. If there's a big disturbance, such as a tornado goes through one natural area, it's much more difficult for those wildlife to move over to another refuge, and things like that, if there's a food shortage in one. But what happens if you introduce a riparian buffer or a riparian area, it creates what's called a transit corridor, or a matrix of ecosystems. And so what happens is you have the animals in one natural area can migrate or immigrate to another natural area, and in the event of any kind of disturbance in one, they can just go and find refuge in the other. What happens is with that increasing connectivity, you also have increasing abundance and diversity. So you might also see things, you might see an increase in the number of lower trophic animals like those deer, turkey, rabbits, things like that. But you might also start seeing some more complex, more demanding animals like foxes or even bear or something like that. Not necessarily saying if you have a riparian area, you're going to have bear in your backyard, but animals do really benefit from these transition corridors and the connectivity it brings. They really like the complex mosaic of habitats rather than just being relegated to a pocket here and a pocket here. One other thing that riparian areas also do is they impart this sense of cultural value and this sense of space. So if you have an urban area, you have this green space that's dedicated to a stream, and you have a riparian area alongside it. It lets people access nature, which they appreciate. They appreciate the wildlife they might see in that nature, in that green space. There's the natural beauty they can take in. And it gives people a great sense of space, which is kind of a complex notion. Some economic benefits to incorporating riparian areas are several features that have economic value. So this was a study done in the Clear Creek Watershed in Washington County, Arkansas, just on the west side of our watershed, west side of Fayetteville. And they were studying land value impact with riparian corridors that were implemented. What they found were people were much more interested and much more willing to pay for higher property values in real estate with those green spaces nearby. That's just one thing. Reduce water treatment costs. When sediment and nutrients hit raw water intake, it takes a lot of money to process that water, and you see it in your water bill. You also see it in businesses and industries' willingness to move to a region depending on the water quality of that. Many canneries, many brewing companies, people like that specifically move to areas based on the water quality. Increased land value we talked about. Reduced land loss due to erosion. Another topic somewhat controversial is sustainable timber harvest. Some landowners who have had a riparian area and they manage it might go in there and harvest the occasional hickory tree for firewood or something like that. But they're good stewards, and they're not denuding the landscape or anything like that. And so we like to encourage that. And it also introduces a small amount of disturbance that keeps that ecosystem healthy without being too much to destabilize things. Some people also like seeing indigenous crops. They might put hazelnuts in their riparian area, or viburnums, any elderberries, things like that, which are edible. Some people also like maintaining riparian areas just for hunting. And so we do have I'm not going to go all through these, but these are just some good examples of native species in those groups we were talking about: trees, shrubs, grasses, wildflowers. Some really common ones we see are things like sycamores, willows, native hollies, deciduous holly, gray dogwoods, and some really common ones we'll see are wood oats, some wildflowers or forbs like bear's foot, cardinal flowers. One we especially love is swamp or rose milkweed. But if you ever have any questions about desirable plants for riparian areas, this is a good place to start, and we have many others we'd recommend. There's just some pictures of what they look like, some things you'd naturally see, like sycamores, pawpaws. I get into a friendly argument with some folks. We have one tree in our area. It's Tilia americana. It's called the basswood, and we get into polite fights with people who want to pronounce it either basswood or basswood. I say it's basswood because the wood was originally harvested for woodwind instruments and bass instruments. Another one of my favorites is black Tupelo or black gum. Some great shrubs we see are, like I said, American hazelnut, witch hazels, viburnums. Nine bark is especially wonderful. Spice bush, musclewood. Fantastic picture from someone who clearly shows why that's called musclewood, because it looks like a corded mussel. Some grasses are really common to see in riparian areas, like riparian rye. If you just drive around streams, especially in fall, you'll most likely see this. It'll stand out as this brown grass. Side-oats grama is one of the few grasses with a really charismatic red flower. This is unfortunately not a picture that shows that here, but it's probably one of the more ornamental grasses. Another common one we see that grows really profusely along riparian areas and floodways is deer tongue grass, and we see this a lot. Bottlebrush rye is an indicator of a quality riparian area or quality woodland, so that's one we really like to see. Wood oats is another fantastic one. It grows really prolifically. It is one of the native species that can be pretty aggressive, so sometimes we like seeing it in rain gardens and things like that because it's low maintenance. But this is not one you'd want to plant in an area and expect it to behave itself, because it won't. It'll be everywhere. And for us, ecologically speaking, that's a good thing. Eastern gamagrass. This is a relative of corn, believe it or not, a distant relative of corn, and has beautiful. In this picture, you're seeing I believe those are the female flowers emerging on it. Everyone likes the wildflowers. We see things like cardinal flowers, blue stars, Virginia waterleaf is another one, jewelweeds, the swamp milkweed we talked about. Cut plant is also really distinct and tends to grow in big patches. And then we get to the baddies. So this is some of the ones that we really do not like to see. These are just some of the most invasive plants, the most common ones that we'll find in a riparian area. And things like bush honeysuckle, if you drive anywhere around northwest Arkansas, especially in June, May, June, you'll see this stuff everywhere. It'll have these adorable little red berries on it, and it's a genuine menace. One that people are not as familiar with, but is very profuse as well, is Japanese stilt grass, also called Nepalese brown top. And this one is very characteristic. If you go out into a stream area right now, you'll probably see this. It has a very distinct habit of what's called thatching. And the grass will come up and it will turn brown in the winter, in the fall and winter, and it'll almost turn over, bowl in over itself, and it creates very distinct appearances just due to that. Another one we like to see, or we don't like to see, and we're probably going to see and smell quite a bit coming up, is Multiflora Rose. It smells wonderful. It's probably one of the worst invasives out there because this one will grab you, snare you, and stab you. It's not one of the friendly ones. Chinese privet is another one. This one is heavily overlooked. People often think of kudzu as being the vine that ate the South. Well, privet is the shrub that actually ate the South. In terms of land area, it's invaded. I believe it eclipses kudzu, I think, many times over. I forget the exact numbers. But this is single-handedly the worst invasive species in the entire eastern half of the United States. So if you see this, please, by all means, get rid of it. Perilla Mint is another one. It really tends to focus on areas of disturbed soils. So if there is a storm event that rolls through and deposits a lot of exposed soil, you're probably going to see Perilla Mint come up. It smells like black anise or licorice, black licorice. It's also often found in East Asian markets as marketed as shisa, because it's often used as an accent piece in East Asian cuisines. Another one you're going to see quite a bit is Japanese honeysuckle. Japanese honeysuckle is very distinct from our native honeysuckles. Japanese honeysuckle has these yellow and white flowers on them. The vines and stems are very pubescent or fuzzy if you look at them fairly closely. And native honeysuckles always have the vine ends in a almost not palm-shaped, but cup-shaped leaf. It's usually two leaves that are fused together. And there usually be a flower blooming out the center of that little plate at the end. It's what we call a terminal leaf. Whoops. Okay, we'll leave that. Okay, so one thing that people often see and often gets them really upset is they come out to a pond or a stream and they see this, and it just makes them really upset. And basically what this is where a beaver has been chewing on this tree. It's an unfortunate part of living in anywhere near water, especially in the mountain areas like here, is you're going to have beavers. Basically what this is beavers being rodents, their teeth grow constantly, and so they have to chew. And they just have this weird evolutionary habit of they are hardwired whenever they hear water flowing to dam it up and stop that water from flowing. Basically what they do is they're called ecosystem engineers, and they tend to convert areas from these tall trees like this along stream beds, and because they can't really use this large timber, and so what they're doing is they're converting this tall tree and this habitat from what you see here into something more like that. And so they really don't like, and they can't use those big pieces of timber and those tall trees with wide bases like us humans like to see. But they can use these really, really numerous and fine stems that you'd see on native species like willows, and a lot of shrubs that would naturally occur along stream beds. And this is something that we get a lot of from landowners is what do I do about the beavers? Are they good? Are they bad? And how can I live with them? And what can I do about them? So the top left picture is an oak tree that was girdled by beaver that I saw out during a site visit recently. Basically, what a beaver is doing here is it has that inclination to chew to maintain the quality of its teeth. And so it's just stripping the outer layers of a tree, and that results in the tree being girdled and eventually dying and falling. That's good and bad. Bad in one way because it's removing that tree, but at the same time, the tree roots are still in place, and so what's holding that soil in place is also still in place. But those beavers are doing what's called coppicing, and coppicing is a European practice where you would take a tree and you would cut it down to the floor, to the soil level, and you would let it regrow. And what it does is when a tree's coppiced, it converts that thick stem into numerous smaller stems, like you see here on the right. And that's just after 1 year of regrowth. This is a common practice that was widespread in Europe during the medieval ages and even today as an effective means of harvesting kindling, firewood, thatching, and just small diameter material, wood material. And this is basically what beavers are doing. They're coppicing those trees. So something that we haven't really studied beavers here in the lower Appalachians and the Ozarks, but it's a big topic of conversation and study in the western part of the United States. And they're taking beaver dams and they're creating something called a Beaver Dam Analog, which is basically, you see here on the right, it's a series of sticks driven into the stream vertically with thatching and sand and mud and things like that piled up against it to see what kind of effect these would have. And basically they're seeing it's a human implementation of what beavers would do naturally. And what it does is it restabilizes that stream, increases the height of the water table, and decreases that erosion. And this is kind of what it looks like in a cross section. Something that I'm personally doing more research into, but like I say, we don't really see it out here in the Ozarks very much. We're seeing a lot of this in Utah and other places, Colorado out west. But I mean, this is basically what beavers are doing. They're converting those tall trees into small twigs and things like that they would use to build these dams to create habitat for themselves, which subsequently also creates a reservoir that's a widened wet plain or widened wetland or a floodplain. And that's basically what happens if beavers were on a stream. This is basically what would happen. The beaver would attempt to build a dam in this narrow stream. If the stream is narrow, so if you have a storm event, it would tend to have a lot of force behind that water, so it might burst the dam, might cause some temporary incising. But then the beaver comes along and dams that back up when the storm abates and widens it out. But that widened stream bed also disperses the force of that water and gives it a much broader area for that water to interface with the surrounding soil, infiltrate down into the ground. And over time, what you have is the development of this widened floodplain or this natural riparian area where that stream has a wide braided channel, usually multiple channels, and there's not quite so much of a water jet effect from that narrow stream that you initially had. So you do have some landscape disturbance in the form of converting those trees into shrubs, converting those big stem trees into multi-stem smaller vegetation. But the end result is you wind up with this much more dispersed ecosystem where the water is spread out, is able to infiltrate down into the soil, and you wind up with an area that can handle much more water in a future storm event. So the Alliance partners with several other organizations, and I just wanted to share this list of informational materials. I'd be happy to share this with anyone. We might be able to share this in the chat. I'm not sure. We also work with several great partners, and we wouldn't be able to do a lot of things we do without them. And so we just want to give a shout out to these wonderful folks. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. I know we didn't cover everything that's related to riparian areas. It's a big, complex subject, and I mean, just talking about any one of those things we could cover in an entire webinar itself, especially beavers, erosive forces, stream channel types, things like that. But I just want to thank everyone for attending. Anna's gonna be asking me some questions that you've shared in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to share them there. And I also want to talk about, just want to share with you to look into our podcast series, We Are Water. You can find that anywhere podcasts are available, such as Spotify. And we do have 2 invasive plant removal events, one coming up at Kessler Mountain Regional Park tomorrow, and one in Winslow that's going to be the Friday after tomorrow. So just want to share that with you. So Anna, do you want to ask me any questions that are coming up? Or?
We have some questions about the plant list. Some people are just wanting that to be shared, which we can definitely do. If anybody, go ahead.
No, I believe we have everyone's emails who registered for this event, so we can share it from there. That might be the best way to do it.
I've put a link to our YouTube in the chat. This presentation will be uploaded and you can rewatch there if you would like.
And I'd be happy to share those landowner resources with the folks who've attended today as well.
Tina has asked if there are any natives that we should not be using.
That's always a tricky one. So one term that you often hear with plants is invasive, and definition of invasive is something that is kind of subjective. Some people say a plant is invasive by definition if it is not native to North America. Another plant, but ecologically speaking, any plant can be invasive if it does not possess or does not have the natural biological controls like what would naturally eat it, disease, disturbance, things like that. So I would just say do some research on what area you're looking to use those plants. Look for what is traditionally grown in that kind of ecosystem and go from there. Things like elderberry or those woodland oats, things like that, they can be aggressive, or even common milkweed can be aggressive. And in certain contexts, that's a wonderful thing. Like you want those plants to be aggressive. That Japanese stiltgrass I was talking about earlier, one of my favorite pictures is was where I saw a patch of jewelweed just completely overtaking it and killing it out. And so that's an instance where you have a very aggressive native species out competing an exotic invasive species. But you know, would I want that jewelweed in my front yard right outside my doorstep? No, I really don't think I would. but along that stream bed, it's a fantastic choice.
And another question from Jane. If landowners are asking about agencies or groups that can help assist with stream bank stabilization, who would you suggest?
I would look into, and we have this in in the resources list that we'll be sharing with the attendees. But Arkansas Game and Fish Stream Team is probably the best one that comes to mind. There are some other projects out there, but they might be limited to folks who are participating in large cost share programs, like landowners who are on EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and those are federal programs, and they may or may not be available to everyone. But I would say look into Arkansas Game and Fish Stream Team is probably the best one, and I do have a link that I'd be happy to share.
Okay, one more from Rick. When landowners reestablish riparian areas, how long does it usually take to go from pasture to a riparian area?
Ballpark, I would say it really depends on if you're just talking a bare pasture to a riparian area, probably about 10 years, I think, is a good number. There were some studies out west looking at beaver establishments of riparian areas, and they were seeing complete vegetation transitions from a prairie ecosystem to a wetland ecosystem within 8 years.
Does anybody else have any questions for the chat box?
And like Becky said in the chat, yeah, if you have any questions, have us come out and take a look at your particular situation. That's one thing I love to do, is just go out and visit with a landowner and talk to me about your land. Talk to me about what challenges you're facing, what your goals are, and I'd be happy to come out and talk to you, give you recommendations that are site specific, draw up a plan, things like that. We're always here to help landowners. We're non-regulatory, so we're not going to tell you, do this, do that, or else, or anything like that. We're here to help you. And my email, if you ever have a question about any of these topics that we covered in this presentation, is nate@beaverwatershedalliance.org. And just share that in the chat box. So like I say, just if you ever have any questions or there's something you want on this, or if you need further information, feel free to reach out to me. I just want to take this opportunity to thank y'all again for attending, and thank my co-host Anna for helping me do all this and get this all put together. And thank y'all again for joining. And have a wonderful day.